Hello and welcome back to the RattleMind podcast. I'm Rye, and joining me as always is my co-host.
Planchi.
And then we still have our special guest of the week.
Potato.
And today our topic is going to be time travel. Mostly, how can you do it? Now, there's been a lot of different ways brought up in media and stuff. The major one being, Back to the Future. Now,
Really popularized it.
yeah, well, actually, if you really want to go back, it's H.G. Wells' Time Machine is what really started it. Which I completely forgot about that while I was looking stuff up.
I forgot about that too. That was like something we were taught in school.
Yeah, it was a really good book. And the good... How many movies were made out of it? There were quite a few movies.
It was remade so many times.
Probably.
But they have a common thing, too, is that in order to actually do time travel, the time travel device has to go with them. Otherwise, you can't travel in time.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the most common way time travel is done, which I also forgot another one to pull up. One that's stupidly apparent, which is Doctor Who.
Oh my god, how did we not think...
I thought about it and I was like, I'm sure they'll think about it. I got beans to eat.
It's like, when I came up with this topic, that was one of the first things I thought of was Doctor Who. But yeah, all of these use the version of the time machine travels with you.
That is technically alien technology, though, to be fair. Like, that wouldn't really, occur to us at our current, state.
Well, technically, it is theoretically plausible that we could travel through time. In fact, in Stephen Hawking's final book, I don't remember what it was called, but one of the last few things he says is about we know how to time travel, we just don't have the means to do it, or something along those lines.
Right. Because if I remember correctly, it has something to do with getting, in fact, to light speed to go and create a wormhole to be able to travel back or forward in time.
We need more gigawatts.
The thing being is that the thing that they say, or at least that I've heard be said about it, is that in real life, we could travel forward in time.
Right.
But they theorize that we cannot travel backwards. Or that maybe in the sense that some people believe that it's just a never-ending cycle, that if we travel forward enough, we could end up in the past.
Yes, that is one of the things that they always tout. Well, I didn't know there were two different versions of wormholes. Schwarzschild's wormhole, and then the Einstein-Rosen bridge.
Yeah, so if I remember correctly, Einstein's is something about traveling distance with a wormhole, whereas the other one is about traveling through time with a wormhole. Einstein's Rosen bridge, if I remember right, is incidentally a pattern that they used in one of the Thor movies.
Yes.
To do the time the travel from Asgard to Earth
the Rainbow
instantly.
Bridge was a Einstein-Rosen bridge.
Yeah. So that's like traveling from space to space, but not through time. The other one is traveling through time to the same space.
Are either of you familiar with A Wrinkle in Time? An amazing book
roughly
that turned into a nifty movie.
I read the book as a kid.
They kind of have they played with that, and that the wrinkle in time is basically if you have a ribbon and you have 2 points in the ribbon and you pinch 2 points far away from each other and just fold them together, and that's the wrinkle in time to close that gap.
That would be the image I just pulled up.
Oh,
that's basically
not exact?
No, this is basically what an Einstein-Rosenberg bridge is. And what it is that you're folding space-time so that 2 points meet at the same time. Now, In A Wrinkle of Time, it's specifically through time travel and not through spatial travel.
Hmm. If I if I remember correctly, there's a bunch of different theories on how that all works, but ultimately there's like, since we as humans perceive time as linear, we think it only goes one way.
Right.
Uh, but in reality, they say that while we perceive it that way, time overlaps in many different spots. And I've seen a few places in various media and like different things that have happened in real life that people have said that, like, they just simply walked into a place and they walked out of another door 5 years later in a different location, or maybe even in the same location, you know
Yeah,
and
that's somewhat the concept of how Doctor Who works with the timey-wimey, wobbly, whatever space thingy he
right.
says.
And that's something I've seen a lot of in the media, but I've also heard like people say that they just lost time and then they just showed up other places.
Yep. There are a lot of stories out there like that. It's There's a different one which I've mentioned before about a guy who was traveling to Japan, and he was
Hmm.
trying to get back to his home country, to a country that
Hmm.
didn't exist.
Yeah, I've heard of that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We just circled back to our episode 0. That's pretty
Yeah,
cool.
pretty much, yeah. Um
Yeah.
but with the one of the things that I wanted to talk about also was how in these versions the time machine has to travel with you, but
Hmm.
in the movie Timeline and I think X-Men the animated series, cuz I think
Hmm.
Bishop went through a time device, but he had to have something to allow him to come back to the original point in time.
Yeah, it was a person manning the actual machine.
Right, and that's how it worked with the movie Timeline as well. They had a pendant with a button that they could press, and it would alert the people
The
in their
person.
time
Yeah.
to pull them back.
Right.
So basically, they were being stabilized, or, well, a homing beacon was attached to them so that they could get back.
Actually, now that you mention that, reminds me of Time Cop as well with Jean
Oh,
Claude Van Damme.
that's another one. Yeah, I completely forgot about that too.
Yeah. Same concept, just they would send out people to police time and all that good junk.
Yeah,
Yeah.
In the magicians, they had an item. It wasn't the same concept though. They had to find
Yes.
the right item to use, but
right.
I guess
And
it's
that
Yeah.
not
goes
very
into Harry
scientific.
Potter. Yeah, that goes into the mystical type of time travel,
Yeah, my bad. Never mind.
which if we could tap into magic, I say let's go for it.
Right. I mean, a lot of people say that, science and magic are not so different. They're just our perception of what
Right.
magic was at the
Well, one of the
time.
cool things about Doctor Who is that there's he had an explanation for everything. Like it was like there was an explanation behind everything that happened. Like even though it looked magical, it was scientific for where they were from. That I always thought that was
Yeah.
kind of cool.
And then
Yeah.
you have the type of time travel. Why won't you go away? For X-Men Days of Future Past, where
Hmm.
his mind was sent along his uh, lifespan,
Timeline.
yeah,
Yeah.
his timeline to be able to go into the past, which is a similar way of how Quantum Leap worked. They sent his mind
Yeah.
through the past as long as he had been alive during those periods of time.
But also they sent him into like different bodies of people.
Yes, which was kind of cool. That's why I
I
liked
really do
Quantum
like
Leap.
that. Yeah. That
Uh,
also is why he did not like Quantum Leap. Like his whole job was fixing like whatever happened that was wrong with that timeline by
right.
like going back in that person's body repetitively until he got it right.
Well, it wasn't repetitively. It was he could only go into the person's body once. Uh,
Oh yeah.
and
Oh, I thought that was multiple times or something. You got
no,
reset. No, I must be thinking of something. No, still.
it
Maybe it
could be
was
with the
multiple
newer one.
people for the
Yeah, it was
same.
always multiple people. There were only a few times that he actually interacted with people he had leapt back into and knew during that time. Uh, One episode, he leaped into a mentally handicapped person, and that was part of the was, and he had to fix it so that I don't remember exactly what it was, but that he could prove that the mentally handicapped person was capable of just being a functional person. I think it's been a long time
Alright.
since I've seen that episode. Then they had a follow up episode to that, and
Mm-hmm.
that one went a little weird because it had a additional leaper involved who was, instead of trying to fix what once went wrong, was trying to destroy what once went right. So
Hmm.
Quantum Leap was fun. It had a lot of weird stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. But Quantum Leap. What was the explanation behind how they did that? Like, I mean, ultimately, I get it that he got constantly transferred into other people's minds with his own mind and all that. But what really was their explanation for how he even did that?
In 1996, a device was created by Dr. Beckett which facilitated time travel. The way the time travel worked, that it could only allow him to travel between points in his own lifetime, which would be between his birth and his death. He never went past his into the future from leaping because he hadn't
He could.
experienced anything because he had already leapt backwards.
Right.
Now, the problem with the device was that they could not retrieve his mind between leaps. So his body was basically in a vegetative state between the times that they were able to locate where his mind had been traveled to.
Hmm.
Actually, I think somewhat of the explanation was that his body kind of just vanished during these periods, but they never actually explained it.
Mm-mm.
Because there was an episode where the person he leaped into, their mind went to the future and inhabited Dr. Beckett's body at the time, which
Huh.
opens a whole bag of worms because there was an episode where one of the people ended up in his body escaped from the uh, quantum leap facility and was out running around in town, and they had to find the person before anything bad could happen, and that way uh, the leaping could still continue. Oh, I know quite a bit
Um,
about Quantum Leap for some reason. I should watch it all over again. Um,
I haven't seen
fair
it. I
enough.
want to now though.
there was an episode where, through a malfunction,
Mm-hmm.
he leapt into his ancestor's lifetime, who
Wow.
was fighting
Really?
in the Civil War.
Huh.
So he literally leapt into his ancestor during the period of the Civil War, and
Well.
during that period he freed a slave who took the last name King because he felt like a king after being freed, insinuating
Martin Luther
that
King.
yeah,
Martin Luther King's ancestor was
yep,
that person.
yeah,
Makes sense. My thing is, during that is if mechanically, even with a malfunction, that he could have, you know, I'm assuming that they're doing this in a laboratory in a certain
yeah,
sense, right? So I'm assuming they're also recording data. Mechanically, it would make sense that if he, even with a malfunction, could leap into his ancestor's body,
right, and
then it
that's
would
how it
make
happened.
sense.
Yep,
Right, right. It would make sense that if they could facilitate that data, that it's possible that he could do it again, but also that opens the possibility that if he can go into people's timelines that are before him, wouldn't that also facilitate that he could go into people's timelines after him?
Yeah,
Although they try to be like, oh well, you can't see the future because you haven't experienced it yet. Sure, but if they could replicate that same kind of data and then try to reverse it, I feel like they could have made it to where he traveled into a thing within his kid's lifetime.
technically they did fix that because he didn't have any kids because he did the experiment before any kids could be sired.
Hmm.
So he didn't have any descendants.
But
Technically,
the problem with that is like, doesn't he ever get out of it?
no. In fact, in the final episode, the very last line is Dr. Beckett never returned home.
Hmm.
Which I've never watched the rebooted series, so I don't know what they did about it.
Hmm. Hmm.
But technically, he did have a kid because during one of his leaps, he
Yeah.
slept with someone and she had a kid. And then he leapt into someone who was helping. It was like a 3-part episode. And
Right.
he deduced by talking to the kid that mentally that child was just like him, had photographic
Right.
memory, almost perfect recall, things like that.
Right, but that would be during his lifetime, some other time in his life,
Right.
and he might be like 5 years old during that time, but that kid would still exist, and then that kid could have kids, and
Actually,
ultimately,
if I remember right, that would have been when he was in his teens, is when she was born.
sure. But ultimately, he could leap into her life then, if that was, because they could make it like, yeah, sure, he never returned home, but since it's based upon like quantum mechanics and quantum physics, I would assume that the thing is that even though technically he's within that time period forever, and he just keeps leaping between people until he runs out of people to leap into, which would be, in a certain sense, ad infinitum. But
Yeah.
like, there's only so many people you can leap into, and depending upon like the population, that can only happen like 7 billion times. You know what I mean?
Right.
But like, um, the kid itself could have been leapt into eventually. Is my point, or stuff like that could have
Right.
happened.
Which
I
would
hear
have and when they started talking about a reboot to Quantum Leap, a lot of
you were
people
kind of
wanted it to be
something like that.
something like she because it was a daughter, she was the one trying to get him back, and in doing so she put herself into it, but that's not how they went. They had another guy do it.
That's kind of sad, but
Yeah.
ultimately, ultimately, I think that it would have been great had they done it where it's like never returned home, and the reboot had like his kid bring him back.
Yeah, that was the whole hope of people who watched Quantum Leap, the original series, wanted it to be.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
So yeah, we
Yeah.
got at least 3 different types of mechanics.
Mhm.
And then okay, the entire reason why I wanted to talk about time travel is because I was watching another podcast and the
Mhm.
host mentioned that if time travel worked, we would get to a point where we could put if we wanted finely aged alcohol, we could just put a barrel in the room and then eventually just go and then travel and get it back. But the way he described it was actually temporal stasis, because it was more or less the only way it would function would be through temporal stasis, where that item was locked and couldn't be interacted with until it reached whatever period they wanted to get it out from.
Mm,
Which would be the Dragon Ball Z type of method, which is the
right.
hyperbolic time chamber.
Right. Which you could do that. That very well could be exactly what you do, but there's also like in a certain sense that does make sense to like say Rick and Morty had a thing like that where they put wine through a portal into a dimension where their time passes like years for
Yeah.
each minute. And technically, that's not really stasis per se, as much as it is that you're just going back and forth because different time elapses. But I think maybe he was meaning like you could leave it there and not necessarily that room itself does anything, because if it's stasis, then you could put it into the room, shut the door, turn it on, and then 7 seconds later pull it out and be aged to
Right.
your like 7 years. But if what he's making it sound like is you just literally travel 7 years into the future to grab the wine and then come back,
Yeah.
like
And
that
that
sounds a little bit more aggressive. I think it's easier to
exactly.
do the stasis than what he was suggesting.
And then there's issues with even that because the fermenting of alcohol, you have to actually rotate the barrel and things like that. So you can't just sit it there.
Right. And then, well, with the fermenting of certain alcohols, you could technically leave it there for a certain amount of time as long as it was in a dry, cool place and a certain way that it rested, because that's what they do with
Right.
wine. Once they bottle it and everything, they can do that. So if it was like wine, some whiskeys, but then whiskeys are also done in barrels, but then eventually are moved to bottles. So like it really depends on
The
to what
alcohol, yeah.
level. Yeah, to what level we're doing that. Like, it might take 3 months to do, say, the fermentation process for a whiskey in a barrel, and then they put it to a bottle. But after that, once it's in the bottle, you could totally let it ferment for 20 years instantly in 20 seconds.
Right. But yeah, there's so much differences in the ways time travel could work.
Hmm.
I just don't know which one would be most plausible. Actually, let me take that back. The one I would assume most plausible is that the time machine must travel with you.
Hmm. Now, my thing is with the fact of like people kind of just walking into places and disappearing out of thin air and then appearing other places that people have reported on, and stuff like that, or even like pictures of people who have clearly don't belong in those eras,
Right.
wearing clothes from very clearly somewhat future type clothing. It seems to me that like it might not be a device type thing that you have to take with you per se. I feel like it might just be you have to know where to walk into, you know? Like, because ultimately, like, the device theory means that, like, that we would call upon it right then with a device to cause it to do that,
Right.
in which that does make sense, and I could feel like that could work. But I also feel like, in a certain sense, we may already have a working time travel type thing, but just not have any control over it,
Which this actually could be plausible, what you're mentioning,
you know?
because the way that they way people tend to talk about how time travel is actually working could be functioning today is due to the Hadron Collider, which creates
Mm-hmm.
micro fissures and stuff in space
Yeah.
through popping in and out because I think they've actually detected a micro black hole that lasted for a millisecond or less at
Yeah.
one point.
Right.
The same thing
And
could be that they're not detecting a wormhole actually opening up
right.
and
And
it's
what I'm
outside of
thinking
their
is,
facility.
well, it's not only just outside of their facility. There's a lot of things that seem to change around 2012 when they did start up the Hadron Collider. And a lot of people mentioned that,
Yeah,
and I know this sounds silly because it's technically a meme, but like they feel like we were slid, like sliding into a different timeline. So there's the idea that there are parallel timelines and that each one different choices are made and blah blah blah. People have they also have the idea that, and I think they like not necessarily prove this, but it's a highly believed theory that when a person dies, they cannot imagine a world in which they've died. So in that timeline, they're dead, but their consciousness travels to a different timeline.
Right.
Some people believe that the Hadron Collider kicking off caused the timeline to go all wonky and slide us into the next one, in which Harambe dies and Trump becomes president, and a bunch of stuff happens that not necessarily isn't supposed to happen, but wasn't supposed to happen for our timeline because it just seems so very shiftily different.
And what you're talking about, I can actually tie back to another TV series, which still follows in this entire thing, is Sliders.
Yep.
Because that's exactly what the premise of Sliders was, basically.
Right. And my other thing is, though, that these events of seeing people that don't belong and people disappearing and reappearing happen long before the Hadron Collider ever got activated. But they have happened in more frequency, according to people and claims, as of past the Hadron Collider being activated. So my theory is that there's always been sort of like a somewhat, so since we see time as linear, we're only going to see from here to the future, but they say that all the time is surrounding itself and it warps in on itself and touches itself sometimes, right? Like everyone does. But the point is that I feel like there's always been spaces, physical places that have been a sort of traveling point from one space and time to another by simply existing there and walking through it.
Right.
And maybe people don't always know that because, such a strange concept, but it would make sense as to how certain places feel different and euphoric and strange and enchanting to people once they get there. This thing could be as big as a car, or it could be as small as a child in a portal, and that's why only children can go through it to experience the Winnie the Pooh universe. But like, it's just like, it makes sense to me that that's always existed, but we don't have a control of where it exists. And then the Hadron Collider thing happens, and then more of those things of positions in which people walk through and exist other places suddenly happen to just happen. And I feel like that's because it created more, and it's just we still don't have control over when we get put toward or where we get put toward, because the portal touches from 1993 in New York to 2007 in Ohio, like it that's what it could be. In my opinion, that seems the most plausible, just because going back to Stephen Hawking, he had a whole party for time travelers. Now, in my opinion, if you're a time traveler and some nerd calls you out,
yeah, he wouldn't want to go there.
You don't show up to the time travel party so you can get arrested by the time cops, okay? That's not what happens. Because everybody knows about the time party. And that's probably why they didn't show up, because the ones that were smart stayed away and the other ones that didn't got caught. And he was just like, well, nobody showed up, So, like, for me, I feel like it's one of those innate things that we have in the world, not just on this planet, but just in space, in various areas of the universe, where it just touches different places, which is why, they also theorize that like light speed can cause a wormhole to open that can take you out,
Right. Part of what you were talking about is part of string theory and a mechanic of how to travel through space, which has been termed as, well, in science fiction, slipstream.
Mm-hmm.
So, It's all of the stuff that we talk about is plausible somehow. So
Yeah.
it's all just we got to figure out how it works.
I feel like to a certain extent the device one we could figure out how it works and somewhat direct ourselves, but I feel like it would be very minuscule. Like I don't feel like it would be years, or maybe if it was years, it couldn't be like 10. It might be like one. You
Right.
know, one at a time, and then you need to charge it and whatever else. But like, um, the concept of like just them existing as portals, I feel like has been a thing forever because we've had so many different races and so many different uh, uh, countries and different uh, cultural groups, like say they've appeared in places that they do not know where they're at, and it was, and then they were sent back, like they just stepped backwards or they were afraid and they returned from where they came, and stuff like that, and it kind of feels like that could be more what we have as a mainstay, but we will eventually develop the technology to like control it. Hello?
I'm still here. I was sorry. I was looking up
I was about
something.
to say. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just like, what? What happened?
Um, it's like the
Just
whole, yeah, uh, Stargates are
yeah,
supposedly exist, and the settlement Anchor Wat is supposed to house a Stargate. And there's ones
yeah,
all over the world that have similar stories of here is a
right.
place that you stepped into it and you traveled to a different place.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and for me, not only does that make so much sense, but like, how many times have we heard about stuff where entire um, cultures or peoples are just gone? And you can chalk that up to conquering or being completely killed, but like a good example of this is the Roanoke Islanders
That's
in
exactly what I was thinking about.
and the Roanoke Islanders completely vanished. They do not know what happened to them. They have some like idea somewhat, like there's markings on trees and different things like that around the area, but they're just gone. Like all of their houses are still like they were there, but they're just gone.
Yep.
All of the people, and no one saw them travel, no one saw them leave, and there were people around Roanoke. It wasn't like they were just there was no people anywhere that had ever seen another Roanoke Islander. There was just they were gone. They just up and left.
Yep. And the only signs of it was that Croatoan was written on a tree or something.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that was all they
And
had.
yeah, and that's all they still have. And to a
Crazy.
certain and to a certain extent, like that's all you really can go off of. Like, where did they go? Maybe, and here's another thing, maybe these portals exist in the sense of like for a limited time in time, you know? They only exist in certain places for a time period of however long that is. So, like, if it's a 3-day period, it only exists for then, and then it shuts the portal. But it takes you 5 years into the future. And then, that portal there only exists for a limited time period. And then you can't get back.
Yep.
And it could take you to a different location as well. So what's to say that they didn't get teleported to the North Pole? Like what's to say that they didn't get teleported to a disproposed point in space for where they're supposed to be in some random place in space, And another thing is like what if what another thing about how travel works, a lot of people question, is like, would it be a thing where we had to be at the rotation of the Earth around the Sun to pinpoint us on the planet?
Right.
Because the Earth rotates its position in the universe, and it also spins in its rotation in the universe. So the question is not just are you trying to appear in the same place, and the exact time you want to be at, but where is that located? Because is it just, oh, we teleport to where Earth is there normally, that's how that works, or do we have to like figure out where exactly that is in space that the Earth was at that time and date?
Yeah, and Doctor Who actually touches on that.
Yeah.
But the whole thing about opening having a specific window to a specific time and then it disappears was actually the plot of a movie called The Time Travelers in 1964. The only reason I know this is because of Mystery Science Theater, the new
Yep.
one.
That makes a lot of sense. We love the new Mystery Science Theater, so.
Yeah. Oh, gotta love Ibn Melchior. The person that never existed.
Never existed, what you mean?
Ibn Melchior was a term they used for people who didn't want their names in credits. So, as you can see, this was directed by Ibn Melchior, written by Ibn Melchior. Well, Ibn Melchior was not a real person. Ibn Melchior was just a name they would put on stuff that they didn't want credits for. Like, I think Ibn Melchior is also credited for Lost in Space, really? Interesting. Yeah.
All the space stuff.
Yeah. Tons of movies have an Ibn Melchior credit for something. There was also another version that, or another name they've gone by, but I don't remember what that new other name is. But yeah, Hollywood's full of weird stuff like that.
Is she having a lot of disconnection issues or something?
I do believe she is.
That explains why she hasn't been talking a lot.
Yep.
Well,
let's see. Is she back? This is the downside.
Back?
Doesn't sound like it.
I do. Yeah.
This is the downside of us doing remote conversations like this. I mean, technically, I could purchase a subscription to a site that would help that we could each go into and host that way. Let's see, she's typing.
Dang.
It's like $30 a month to do it that way. But we've actually gone overtime like we have for the entire week, which is cool.
Well, I guess back to the topic?
Yeah, back to the actual topic and not, movie stuff. But yeah, I would assume that the only way you'd have to take a device to travel through time would be my assumption of how it would work. Otherwise, it would be a little more complicated because with the movie timeline, as you have to have something that can signal throughout time.
Right.
So it's like, how are you going to make sure you're getting the right signal? What if someone else is using that signal at the same time so that they could get back from time?
Well, there's also the idea of that, like, they could technically track it from when in time it was. Like, the theory that you belong to a certain time period based upon where you're at in your time period when you travel. So, like, you're supposed to be, when you're 35, you're supposed to be in that place where you're 35 as your timeline. And if you leave that timeline and go backwards or go forwards, you have like a residue that emits from you that they could like track. And I assume that that's something that they're going to try to like apply to the device that could call back, because that device would also be from that point in time that you were and was created within that time. And so like I'm assuming that they're being like, "Oh, well, we can recall it because it has a specific time signature just like
Yeah,
you do."
I
And
think
if
that's
those
what
two
it goes.
time signatures match up, then we know we're supposed to pull you back. Because I'm assuming, if I remember right, like with Time Cop, they had a chip in him as well that like monitored him and his time signature type deal as well. So I assume that that's the way they're doing that. They're like, it has
Yeah,
a residue, and ultimately, I think that that might not be based in reality too much, but I mean, to a certain extent, it could be because we don't know necessarily that it is or isn't because we haven't definitively done it, or maybe that is a way that we just aren't going for, even
right,
if we do it. So, like, um, for me, I'd say that all three are somewhat equally plausible, um, but that one would probably be a little bit more finagly. I mean, to me, the idea of detecting a particle that we can't detect now is super relatable to current, science because, like, I mean, we can detect that dark matter exists,
right,
but we can't detect dark matter. Like, there's the space in between matter that we can detect, and there are pockets of it that grow, but we can't really detect the dark matter itself. It's like the absence of matter is what we're detecting, but it's
right.
very clearly something that's there. We just can't see exactly what it is. Or gravity. We understand that gravity exists and that centrifugal force exists, but there are particles that they say exist called gravitons that prove exactly how gravity exists, but they can't detect those particles. They see the absence of something, much like with dark matter, and they know something's there. They just can't detect it. So to me, like having a time signature where there's particles that could be detected that otherwise people couldn't detect otherwise is entirely plausible. You
Yeah,
know. Um, Aside from that, I'd say the one that seems the least likely is honestly the quantum leap or the days of future past
yeah. Sending a
time
mind
travel.
through time. Yeah,
Sending your mind through time seems the least likely, but at the same time, that we recently discovered that the mind is the exact blueprint for understanding time travel and multidimensional travel because we have a comprehension in our brain of 11 dimensions. And I read that like literally earlier today. And it has the capability to show us a lot of different stuff that we don't fully understand quite yet, but that transcends certain biological understandings. So, like, obviously we're just uh, meat puppets with bone mechs that has an electrical system for our meat brain in the center. But like, where does the personality come from? Where does this come from? Is it just chemicals? Well, they've noted that when a person dies, that they literally lose point 0.7 weight,
yeah. The
like
weight of the
kilograms of
soul.
weight, the
Yeah,
weight of a soul. And so it's like, does the consciousness go somewhere? And which also comes back to the parallel sliding and everything else. So like ultimately, I feel like there is something there that we're like very on the edge of achieving in all of the aspects, you know. But the last one that seems the most like the least likely is the mind one, but also even the mind one plays into what could be possible.
yeah. Because with the whole weight of the soul thing, that just actually does bring in the conversation that it is possible, but it's so far fetched that we can't get around what it is.
Right.
Yeah, speaking of minds, consider mine rattled.
She's
I've
just like,
learned so much.
I have no idea where all this came from. She's
I
it's like,
mean, it's fascinating stuff. I'm really enjoying just listening. I don't have much to add, but like, man, there's a lot more to it than I thought.
Oh yeah, there's a
yeah,
lot we could keep on. We could probably keep on going for hours on end, but
Right.
yeah.
we're at 45 minutes, so probably a good
I
time
think
we
it's
wrap
time.
it up. Yeah.
Yep.
So,
It was good though.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So, as always, I want to thank everyone for watching and listening into our podcast. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And any final thoughts or words from you guys?
No, just thanks for listening. And actually, you know what? This episode, as the last one of the week, David, do you have anything you want to ask our listeners that they can comment about?
uh, well,
Or
I
I'm
gotta ask
sorry,
you guys.
potatoes.
I've got to ask you guys. What things do you think about time travel? Is there anything you specifically saw that you could really
We're trying
give
to
to
wrap up
us?
the episode and ask our
Let us
ask
know.
our
Yeah.
listeners to comment later.
I
Yeah,
know.
yeah, that's what he's doing. He's asking them
Let
to,
us know.
yeah, comment on their thoughts about it.
Let us know about what you think about that. Tell us what you've seen or what you've
Oh,
experienced. Tell us what you might have gathered in information. Maybe there's something we missed, or maybe there's something we could look into. Talk about it again sometime. Bring it up, comment about it, and let us know.
Yeah,
I'm
well,
sure it'll
sorry, the
be
way he
interesting.
said you guys,
yeah.
like it was so emphasized, I thought.
All right.
Well, not you two. The
Yeah,
watchers at
yeah,
large.
tell us your stories. Yeah,
All right.
let us know what you know.
With that, please
All
do
right.
as he asked.
Yes.
And until next time, later.
Bye.
Bye bye.